Hello and welcome all. We want to give everyone a few minutes to log on. And as you log in, if you could feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat would be great. We'll give people a couple minutes to log in. Hello, Manuela. Thank you for introducing yourself. If everyone could just log on and introduce yourselves in the chat, we'll start in just a moment. All right, as people are logging on and introducing themselves in the chat, I'd like to say hello and welcome everyone to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines Affordable Housing Opportunities for Native Communities webinar. My name is Fern Ori. I'm from the Owista Corporation. I am the Chief Programs Officer and EVP of Strategy and Advocacy. I wanted to have Denise introduce herself briefly before I speak again on Owista.
Hi everyone, I'm Denise. I'm the Communications Officer at Owista. Thank you for joining us today. And I will also be your tech support for today. So if you have any issues, just send me a little private message in the chat and I'll turn it over back to Fern.
Thank you, Denise. So the Owista Corporation is a national native CDFI intermediary. And we are excited to partner with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines in providing this webinar opportunity for everyone. I did want to mention that we will be allowing the last 15 minutes of the session for Q&A. You can put your Q&A in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A box. And once we get to the last portion of the presentation, we will have time for answering questions. And in the meantime, I'd like to welcome Renee and Ryan, and I will hand it off to Ryan.
All right, well, thank you very much, Fern and Denise, giving us opportunity and letting us just share a little bit for those of you that don't know much about the Federal Home Loan Bank at Des Moines and the opportunities we have. And then as I was going through some of the list, I noticed some familiar names as well. So it's good to have a combination. And then for those of you on the call, thank you very much for taking an hour out of your time. But obviously, it's important stuff that you guys do on the ground, and hopefully we can provide some additional resources or at least some information that you guys might be able to use on the go forward from that perspective. So anyway, thank you very much. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so as Fern said, my name is Ryan Sullivan. I'm the product manager for our community investment group, and Renee, she's going to be sharing here in a little bit. She's our rental housing manager, manages all our rental housing projects that we have within the organization. And so just the first thing we're going to do is just talk through the agenda a little bit. So I'm going to give a high level of what the Federal Home Loan Bank is, who we are, And then we're going to really talk about the meat and potatoes of the competitive affordable housing program. About a year or so ago through AWISTA, we were able to talk about our down payment assistance program. And now we're going to transition and talk about our competitive program that we have within our organization. So we're going to go through a high level overview, a few the project types, a couple case studies, who are the sponsors and members, eligibility and scoring, and feasibility, and then we'll wrap it up with our monitoring requirements, and then close it out real quick with our contact information, as well as Fern said, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. So we're going to go through this information pretty quick. We have a lot of information to go through today, and realize all the stuff we could talk through one-on-one with you. It's on our website as well, but just want to give you kind of a high-level understanding and let you get some initial thoughts in your head and where we can go from here. So go ahead and flip to the next stage. All right. So it's kind of interesting or ironic. I think about the Federal Home Loan Bank in our name, and it is interesting. We're really not federal, and we don't do home loans, and we're not a bank in a sense. So we have members, about 1,300 members, and we're really, I like to say, a bank for our members, or a bank for our members, so credit unions, banks, and a handful of insurance companies, and so on. And we're thought of, we're like a GSE, or a government-sponsored enterprise. So think of a Fannie or Freddie under that umbrella with it. And we're initiated in 1932. There are 11 independent federal home loan banks across the United States. And so you'll see on that map there, we're in the green. We have about, we have 11 Midwest to West states, plus Hawaii and Alaska. And then we also have 3 Pacific territories that we're in. So the Federal Home Loan Bank at Des Moines makes up everything in the green section of that map below. And how we come about and how we come up with the funds on an annual basis is the banks reserve 10% of their net income each year towards affordable housing. And over the lifetime from Federal Home Loan Bank, we've had about $665 million. And last year, we put $41 million towards affordable housing. So annually, there's a lot of work that's going on within our footprint, the work that you guys do to maintain or create affordable housing within your areas. You can go on. All right, so now we're going to talk just a little bit about what competitive affordable housing program is. And so you're going to see us referencing AHP often in here. And so that's just the affordable housing program as we go through this. So it is competitive subsidy program. It's based on the eligibility of your project, number one. We go through scoring, and it's a top down. We don't pick and choose what projects get it. It's really the scoring that goes along with it. It starts at the top, and we go down the list for all our viable projects to receive funds on an annual basis. And we want to make sure that project is feasible with it. And so Renee is going to go through some of those things later on in the deck. We are a gap funding. So we're really the last one to the table when it comes to the funding source of it. So some projects, the Federal Home Loan Bank grants might be the only funding towards the project. And you'll see that in one of our examples. Or there might be stack funding with it. So there could be several funders within the project. And you'll see one of those projects as well in one of our examples. So the funds can be used for rental and home ownership projects. So when we think about those types of projects, their purchase, their new construction, their acquisition of properties and rehabilitation of them, or they might be just a rehab of a project. So there's various ways that you can utilize our competitive funds within the work that you might do within your organization. So we assist 80% area median income and below. And then specifically for rental projects, 20% of the households must be at or below the 50% median income. Along with that, our annual subsidy for our 2022 round that will occur this year is each project is a maximum of $750,000 per grant that we give out at a max of $40,000 per unit of housing. And the last thing I want to point out before we go on, we have what we call an implementation plan on our website. And it's a really detailed, great guide for you if you're interested and, before you want to reach out, to take a look at that. It has all the information that you would need out there to really get started and understand the program. And that is on our website of fhlbdm.com. And you'll see it out there. It's year over year. We consistently put a new one out there every year for us. So the most current one out there right now is that 2022 implementation plan, or IP plan that we call it, or IP. All right. Thank you. So we're going to talk about a few of these components a little bit later, but we wanted to move it up within the deck just so you guys are aware. So there is a process to what we do, for the competitive program. So we are what we call now in our technical assistance stage. So that started on March 1st. It goes for another month through April 28th. And that gives anybody, whether it's a sponsor or member, we're going to talk about the difference here in a couple slides, but that gives anybody any questions they might have about the program, specific project questions. It's a time for you to really reach out, invest the time, and let us partner with you and help you answer your questions. So when you take that next step, if you choose, that you can, when you submit your application, which starts on May 2nd and goes through June 13th, it lets you put your best foot forward through that application process. So the reason I want to get that out there now, if you do have a project that might be in mind, and you're thinking, hey, this might be a great fit, call us, or email us. We're here to help you out and walk you through the technical assistance piece of it and answer any question you might have. So once again, you're ready to go and put the time in for the application part of it. It does have a hard deadline, 4:30 p.m. Central Time. I always want to call that out because it does have to be within the system, approved off by the sponsors and members. If it's 4:31, unfortunately, it doesn't go, but just wanted to call that out. Or if you don't have a project now, but you might next year, generally, it's the same timelines roughly of when we do our technical assistance and our application period. All right, we'll move on here, Denise. So a couple case studies that I just mentioned just a little bit ago. So this is an owner-occupied rehab. So this falls under the home ownership umbrella. The sponsor was White Earth Housing Authority. And this one was to preserve, it's 100% rehab. The people own their house. And it's really to provide health and safety within the homes of people within their community. So to win this award, it was $1 million grant. FHLB was the only funder in this thing, and they allocated approximately $25,000 per home over 40 homes. And what this did, and you can see in there, in this example, they put a new roof on, new siding, a new deck, but it can be all kinds of things that go into a home that will preserve the health and safety of the families or individuals living in there. So it could be access in bathrooms, flooring, or so on, but anything, new heating and cooling or furnaces and whatnot. There's a lot of things that align to it. And once again, that information is in our IP of the types of work that can go on, but this is really a great opportunity for people that just don't have the funds to maintain their home to make the updates that are needed. You can move on to the next one. All right, the next one is a rental project, and it's also a rehabilitation project, as well as Minnesota. It just happens to be the two we stagger out of Minnesota. But the sponsor was the American Indian Community Housing. And this one's a pretty cool one where it's a 29 unit project that helps singles and families experiencing homeless. And they also provided services within this one from case management, advocacy, support services, and cultural activities. And as I mentioned before, the past project where the Federal Home Loan Bank was the only funder in this one, This one, we were a part of that stack. This project was $8.4 million. And we were a piece of that at $500,000 with the grant. Where the last funding is in it, as I mentioned, we're gap funders, but it's a very different type of project. And like I said, it's just stack funding. There's a lot of different ways you could do it, but a great project that the American Indian Community Housing program or sponsor completed. All right, you can move on. All right, so a couple more slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Renee. But there's a couple key things that just can kind of, I want to say, get confusing or whatnot. But we have really kind of 3 key pieces, at least for every project. And number one is the sponsor. And that's what most of you guys are. So a sponsor is typically a nonprofit or government, housing authority, or Native American tribes, you know, that are a sponsor. So you have to be integrally involved. So to be eligible for scoring, you must be integrally involved in the planning, development, or the management of the project. And for rental projects, sponsors must have a controlling ownership interest in the project. So this doesn't mean that for-profits cannot or can't apply for it. They can apply, but there is points that are awarded for a sponsor that meets one of the earlier items I was talking about as a nonprofit for it. So that's the first one on there. Let's move on to the member. So who is a member? That's the other piece of it. So we have sponsors that will come to us saying, hey, I have a project that I just don't have a member. So members are one of those 1,300 organizations that belong to the Federal Home Loan Bank, and they partner with projects all across our footprint. And so from that perspective, it's not real hard. The place to look for a member, number one, is a lot of times you guys have relationships with a bank or a credit union that's already a member. So if you're interested and you don't have one yet, the first people I would call is a member, or you're the member that you might work with. And then if you don't have one, we have a membership directory on our website that lists all our members, and we can look up the geographic area you might be in and reach out to them to see if they might be interested in partnering in a project with you. And if you need assistance with that, once again, we're happy to help out with that and try to initiate that process and kind of do a handshake or a handoff to get the relationship started. So don't ever let that be something that you're thinking, I just don't have a member that I know of or to work with me. Reach out. We're willing to take a look at that and see what we can do to help you out with it. And then the members have a benefit for doing it too. So obviously, it's great community relationships out there. So those people that are in the houses or in the apartments or units that they're in, they're customers, and they want to see people succeed and thrive within the communities they're in with it. So it helps them expand their customer base too. It also provides, an opportunity for the CRA or community reinvestment and compliance benefit for them. And then overall, it helps the community and keeps the dollars local with it. So that's the second component. So we have sponsors, we have members, and then obviously the Federal Home Loan Bank. We're really that third key component of it, as well as any other funders that might be to the table. So with that said, I'm going to pass this off to Renee.
Thanks, Ryan. So all affordable housing applications are subject to 3 things, and that's eligibility, scoring, and feasibility. And I'm going to do a high-level overview of each of those items. Next slide, thank you. So eligibility requirements are those minimum things that a project needs to do to even apply for an AHP subsidy. For rental projects, at least 20% of those households must be at or below 50% of area median income. If you have a homeownership project, all units must be below 80% of area median income. As Ryan had mentioned previously, we are a gap funder, and so the project always needs to demonstrate a need for subsidy. In addition, there are some timing restrictions on using that subsidy if you were to be awarded For rental projects, you have 3 years since time of award to complete your project. And for homeownership projects, you've got 2 years to complete your project. And all projects are subject to a retention or a deed restriction. Rental projects, that retention agreement goes for 15 years. And for homeownership projects that include new construction or act rehab, it's a 5-year deed restriction. And just to point out, that time clock starts when your construction is complete. So for example, if it takes 2 years to get your construction or rehabilitation completed, the 15-year start or the 5-year start after that 2 years of construction development phase. Next slide. So now we're going to touch on some scoring. We've got 7 different scoring criterias, and you'll notice here on the screen that we've got some point categories that are fixed, and while others are considered variable. Variable means that we have multiple ways to get points in that particular category. You'll also notice that all the points add up to a 100-point maximum. However, this isn't like high school algebra where you need 90% or above in order to get an A or to get funded. As you can see on the slide, I've indicated what the 21 funding points look like. So the highest funded project in last year's round received a score of roughly 74 points, and the lowest funded project received a score of roughly 61 points. Next slide. Now I'm going to cover on a really high overview of what those 7 scoring criteria are. I'm going to emphasize, and Ryan had already hit on this, we've got that implementation plan that details all the requirements for each scoring criteria. And it's really important that as you do your application, if you decide to submit one, that you pay special attention to the rules and how to get scoring for each scoring criteria. So scoring criteria 1 is donated and or discounted property. It is a 5-point variable category. You can get 1 point for any land or units conveyed by the federal government, or you can get up to 5 points for land or units donated, or 5 points for land or units purchased at a discount. For both the discount and donated points, in order to be even considered, there has to be a minimum of 20% either donated or 20% discounted. We do consider long-term nominal leases. They do qualify. The Des Moines Bank considers nominal leases as $100 or less. And it's important to remember that only arm's length transactions are eligible for points. So if the ownership entities between the donor and the donee, if they are related in any way through ownership, that does not qualify for points in this priority. And just to keep in mind also that donation or conveyance has to have occurred within the last 3 years of application. It can go up to 7 years under very special circumstances, and that is at the discretion of the bank. Criteria 2 is the nonprofit government sponsorship. This is a 10-point fixed category. Ryan kind of hit on this when he discussed who the sponsor is in terms of applying for an AHP subsidy. Projects, it's a nonprofit organization, a state agency, it could be a housing authority, Native American tribe, of course, and Alaskan Village. Ryan also had mentioned that those nonprofits or tribal entities must be intricately involved in the project. They also have to have controlling ownership in both governance and decision-making, as well as financial interest in the project, as well as any financial returns, and that's for rental projects. For homeownership projects, they have to play at least 2 of 3 integral roles to be eligible for points. And those roles are identified at the bottom of this screen, and they include qualifying borrowers or arranging for financing, providing direct empowerment services, maybe they're managing the acquisition or the construction or the rehab of the property. Those are all qualifying ways that a nonprofit can demonstrate being intricately involved and to get those points. Next slide. Criteria 3 is our rental income targeting. Targeting is calculated slightly differently based on if it's a rental project or homeownership project. This first slide discusses how the points are allocated for rental projects. Again, as Ryan mentioned, and I mentioned as well, to even be eligible to apply, you need to have at least 20% of your units reserved for incomes less than 50% AMI. It is a 20-point category, and the way you get all 20 points is you reserve 60% of your units for incomes less than 50% AMI. If you do that, you get the full 20 points. If you do less than that, there is a mathematical equation that's actually quite simple, and it's outlined in our implementation plan. And it's a sliding scale based on the targeting you are going to commit to. And that can range probably between 16 and 20 points, depending on the targeting you commit to. Households must have incomes meeting the targeting at initial occupancy. We do verify that information after the project is completed. And it's important to remember that this is, for at least rental projects, a 15-year retention period. So it's important that the targeting that you commit to an application, you remember that this is the targeting that's expected for the 15-year retention period. A little tip or trick here for both homeownership or rental is that once you get the 20 points, let's say I've got a 10-unit project that I'm going to develop. It's rental housing. I've got 6 of the 10 units that I'm willing to set aside for tenants making less than 50% AMI. I don't get bonus points for doing more than 60% of my units, less than 50% AMI. So as an applicant, I would probably choose to then move my remaining 4 units to incomes less than 80% of AMI, and that allows me for flexibility in future years. Again, it's 15 years is kind of a long retention period. So if you allow for that flexibility, projects end up being more successful in the long run. Next slide. And so homeownership income targeting, again, it's 20 points as well. And they are if 20% or more of your units are for 60% or less of AMI, and that's how you get your maximum points in this category. And then as you can see on this slide, it's a laddered approach, almost a bucket way to get your points with a sliding scale of 16 to 20 points. And again, you know, once you get your percentage met, it might be the smart idea to move your other targeting up for future flexibility. We haven't moved enough in this room. I think our lights just turned on. We got to do jumping jacks or something. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, scoring criteria number four, which is economic opportunity or empowerment. This is a fixed 5-point category. In order to get points in this category, you have to have one service, empowerment service, that you're offering to your tenants or your households. It is a drop-down list, so it's a set list that you can choose from, but that includes employment, education, training, home buyer, home ownership counseling, childcare, which does include adult daycare services, tutoring, resident involvement in workforce preparation. Sponsors have to complete a memorandum of understanding, or what we call an MOU, at the time of application. This is a template form that we have on our website that can be filled out and signed by the service provider and the sponsor and just uploaded with your application. A few things to keep in mind for this criteria is that the empowerment service that you choose to provide has to be offered to all tenants. Now, not all tenants or households have to take you up on the service, but it does have to be offered to everyone. And empowerment programs that you choose should make sense for the tenant population. For example, if I have a development that is senior housing, and senior housing may be age 62 and above, and the service I'm choosing to provide is childcare, then we would probably question how that's relevant for the tenants and the project that you're developing. So just something to keep in mind there. I will also say from a scoring perspective, that most, if not all projects have to hit in this 5-point category to get awarded funds. It's very rare that we see a project not apply in this category and be awarded funds, if that makes sense. So if you've got questions about, none of these come to light on what you could be offering, it's a good idea to give us a call, and maybe we can walk through some ideas that would help you score in this category, because it's an important category that most other projects are going to hit on. Next slide. Okay, criteria 5 is underserved communities. It's a 25-point category, so it's a big one. And there's multiple ways to get points in this category. The first is housing for homeless. It's up to 10 points, and it's a laddered scoring based on the percentage of units reserved. The more you reserve, the more points you get at a 10-point maximum. Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines has our own definition of homelessness. That definition can be found in our implementation plan. Our definition does closely mirror the definition of HUD's, except we allow for doubled up. As part of our definition, especially for Native communities, that's a really important addition that we decided to add. And so hopefully that's something that you guys could take advantage of if you were thinking about applying. We also have housing for special needs, which is up to 10 points. Again, this is a laddered point category. So the more you reserve for these special needs individuals, the more points you can get, up to 10. They include elderly, disabled, formerly incarcerated, unaccompanied youth, and persons recovering from substance abuse, physical abuse, or persons with HIV or AIDS. And the last category in this criteria is for housing for other targeted populations, which is a maximum of 5 points. Those include veterans and agricultural workers. Again, it's a laddered scoring based on the percentage of units reserved. Next slide. Criteria 6 is our community stability, which includes preservation. It's a 12-point variable, so a lot of ways to get points in this category. The first way is to get 10 points. You can, if you've got a project that is preserving federally assisted housing, and examples of that would include a USDA 514, 515, 516 project. If you've got an existing LIHTC project, if you've got a HUD 202 or a HUD 811 project, those are all qualify under the preservation and could get you 10 points in this category. Next is 5 points for adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is changing the use of an existing building. So if you've got, an example would include if you've got a school that you're changing the use from the school to housing, that's an example, or a commercial building to housing, a church to housing. Those are all good examples that we've seen in the past that will receive 5 points in this category. 5 points for rehabilitation or demolition of vacant and abandoned buildings. 5 points for acquisition and rehab of naturally occurring affordable housing. That means if a sponsor is going to acquire a project that isn't currently income restricted, and with the affordable housing grant, it's now going to be income restricted. And 12 points for rehabilitation of owner-occupied housing. Next slide. Finally, criteria 7 is our bank district priority, which is a big points earner. It's 23 points. And as you can see with the busiest on the slide, there's a lot of ways to get points. The first one is probably going to apply to most people on this call, which is 5 points for being within the Des Moines district. As Ryan had mentioned, if you're not within the district, that doesn't mean you can't apply. You just don't get points in this particular category. You can also get 10 points for rental new construction, 24 units or less. The caveat to this point, earner, is that it really does need to be all 100% new construction and 100% 24 units or less. We'll often see projects that are coming in with an existing building that they maybe are going to do some rehab on, but they're going to then add some new construction units into that existing building. Unfortunately, that does not qualify for points in this category. The next category is subsidy per unit, which is 5 points, and that's a variable points. The project that comes in with the highest subsidy per unit gets 0 points. Our highest subsidy per unit is $40,000 per unit. We will always have people come in at the $40,000 per unit or whatever that max is per year. Those folks will get 0 points in this category. The project that comes in with the lowest subsidy per unit gets 5 points. Historically speaking, we never know until we get all the applications, but I'm going to say roughly between probably $1,200 to $2,000 is your lowest subsidy per unit. Again, it depends and changes from year to year. There's a very complicated mathematical equation that I could never even begin to duplicate that gets you what your points are for all the projects in between the low and the high. If you've got questions on what you think your points might be in this subsidy per unit category, we encourage you to give us a call, and we can look at former or previous years to see where this might come in. You know, again, we're just guesstimating until all the apps come in, but we're happy to help you try and guesstimate a score for this subsidy per unit. Then 12 points for sponsor-driven new construction. Owner-occupied units, and again, this is 100% of the units that are sponsor-driven. The next slide. And finally, 13 points for native housing projects. And so this is huge. This is our biggest point earner of our entire application. All eligible projects who get the 13 native points as our tribal government or an agency of the tribal government, could be an Alaskan village, it could be a TDHE. All those entities are eligible for the 13 native housing projects. If you have a project and you're not, and the project owner isn't a qualified TDHE or a tribal government or an Alaskan village, etc., you can also include tribal funding as a source of funds and still receive the 13 points in that category. And there are some caveats for both rental and homeownership projects on minimum amounts that have to be as a source of funds, and that can be found in our implementation plan, but it's another way to get points in this category. Next slide. So how competitive is my project? We touched on this a little bit ago. If you've self-scored your project, and just a tidbit here, on our website, we have got for both rental projects and homeownership projects a really nice self-scoring spreadsheet. It'll go through the 7 criteria. It adds up your score for you. It gives you a brief overview of what each priority is, but it's a brief overview. So again, don't overlook doing the research into the implementation plan. But as you can see, these are the past 3 years scoring from 2021 to 2019, the amount of money that we had available each round, how many projects we awarded, and the scoring ranges, which typically for the past 3 years at least went from a high from 74 to roughly 76, and the lowest funded from roughly 59 to 62. I've been here for 15 years now in this department, doing affordable housing program grants. And I usually say that if you are self-scoring and you've got a project that is, mid to upper 50s, 60s and above, that is a pretty competitive application. And if it were me thinking about applying, I would probably think it's worth my time to go ahead and submit an application. If you are self-scoring your project and you are in the low 50s, 40s or below, then you'd probably want to just consider, is it worth the time and effort to submit an application, kind of the time versus reward. So just something to consider. Again, in my 15 years here, the lowest I've seen the project score go is roughly 54 points. I don't know what happened that particular year to get it that low. I've never seen it before, and I haven't seen it since. So usually, high 50s, low 60s is where it tends to hang out. But I don't have a crystal ball, and so I don't know how competitive the applications are going to be or how many applications we're going to get from year to year. But that just gives you a general idea from the range perspective. Next slide. Project feasibility. So I've got 2 slides here on project feasibility, and every time I say that, it makes me kind of chuckle because, we can wrap up scoring in a few weeks, and then we take the highest scored projects, and we go into what we call project feasibility. And we have a team of analysts that go into in-depth, and the in-depth takes 3 months, sometimes longer, to get through all the information. So it's ironic that the 3 months is really boiled down into 2 slides. But what is project feasibility? So again, broken record here, but that implementation plan outlines all of our feasibility guidelines. And we do a check and compare what your project looks like in comparison to all of our feasibility guidelines. Incomplete or inconsistent applications could disqualify a project. We've seen that a handful of times, and it's unfortunate. So it's really important that you spend the time and energy and effort to put forth a positive or a complete application. You do have to complete feasibility workbooks and some exhibits and some attachments. Those attachments and our feasibility workbooks are on our website. The workbooks will alert you if you are outside of our guidelines and any of our costs, etc. Rental workbooks, for example, are going to ask for things like your sources, your uses, your cost breakdown, your pro forma, and that's uploaded in the AHP application. Next slide. What if my project deviates from any of the feasibility guidelines? It does not mean that the project is automatically disqualified. We will ask for an explanation that helps justify why we should grant an exception. And we do ask that those explanations be logical and hopefully measurable. And I'll give you an example of one that we see quite often. It is operating cost per unit. So for rental projects, an operating cost per unit guideline, or our benchmark, is $5,000 per unit per year. Let's say that you've got a project that wants to apply and your operating cost per unit is $6,000 per unit per year. An example of a justification that would be acceptable is that you, as the project owner, pay for tenant utilities. Let's pretend like that tenant utility is $1,000 per unit per year. That would help be a logical and both a measurable justification to go ahead and allow us to grant an exception for that particular feasibility guideline. Next slide. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan to have him give you some information about how successful our native projects have been in the past.
All right. So I'm going to bring this home. I know we're kind of getting into our 15 minutes Q&A, so I'm going to cover the last couple of slides here pretty quick. But I just want to point out, the native projects over the last 3 years, they out of the projects that have been submitted, 3 out of 4 of them have been awarded funds. That's extremely high. And we go back to that scoring criteria number 7, where that 13 points is there. So what we see, if there's a native tied to it, in general, it has a really good opportunity to be looked at and to be funded. So we want to make sure you know that. And 25% of the funds that went out over the last year, you can see, have been towards projects tied to native. So, which is a really awesome story, but it'd be really neat to continue to grow this area. So go ahead, next slide. All right, so, the application process, there's a lot there, but the one thing we want to make sure, it's not, hey, you're done at the application process if you've been awarded funds. There is some monitoring that Renee mentioned before, but first and foremost, there's those retention agreements for rental and then home ownership if it's new construction or an acquisition rehab. We do have semi-annual progress reports that we send out in March and September that the sponsor has to complete. We do underwriting of the project specifically for rental. It's done at 3 different times. Once up at front of the application. We're going to review it again at disbursement when you guys are requesting your funds that you've been awarded, as well as project completion. And then if there's anything that's going outside of what you guys and the sponsor is committed to in the project from a non-compliance that's outside of the guidelines, we will be watching for that. We might be working with you on a compliance plan or watch list. And if there's a failure to comply with it, we may look at recapturing funds or de-obligating the funds before giving them to you. So there is work. We want to make sure that you guys understand once the application's done, and if you're awarded funds, that there is a process that we will be connected with you as we go through the project life cycle. And then the last slide here is around technical assistance. So we talked a little bit about this in the first couple of slides, but we're in that area right now. So if you guys have questions about projects that you currently have or they're going on, let us know. I know the information that we ran through over the last 45 minutes might seem a lot, and there is a lot of information there, but we're here to help you. So if you've got a question, Renee mentioned, scoring yourselves, we do have a sheet out there, whether it's a rental or home ownership, that you can score, just get an idea of where you might be at on a project that you have coming up. And so on, reach out to us. We are here to help. Don't let this thing or don't walk away from this thinking, man, this is really tough, or there's a lot to it, I don't want to do it. Let us have that conversation with you, and let's talk about the project that you might have going on with you in your area, your organization. We would love to partner with you on it. So, and I'm going to wrap it up and we'll get to questions, but we can go to the next slide. Our contact information is here. Reach out to Renee or myself, and hopefully, I think Denise will get this sent out to you guys, but we're here to help. And one of our analysts, we can get you hooked up, have a conversation. Once again, walk through your organization, what you want to do, does it line up, whatever you need, whatever questions you have, let us know. We are here and we'd love to partner with you and see what can be done with you. All right. Renee, anything before we open it up to Q&A?
I think so. Bring on questions. We welcome any project specific questions or any questions in general.
All right.
Again, raise your hand if you have any questions and we can unmute you. And also, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A chat box. There are a few questions so far, starting with one from Johnny. Touching on repayment of the grant.
I'm sorry.
Could you restate that? I'm sorry. No.
Can you touch on the repayment of the grant? It depends if it's, ideally there is no repayment. So if you do what you committed to do in the AHP application for whatever that retention period is, whether it's 15 years for rental or 5 years for home ownership, there is no repayment. It's a forgivable grant after that retention period is expired.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, Johnny.
Okay. Hey, thanks, guys. So in one of your slides, it talked about a repayment. So I just was wondering what has to transpire in that project or in that transaction that would require a repayment of that grant. It was like the last piece, but you moved on to the next slide before you talked about it.
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember which slide it was.
Yeah. It was monitoring. So it's hard to say one thing that would force a project to repay, or we'd ask for a recapture of that AHP grant. The project would have to take a pretty left turn and be unwilling to get back into compliance. And so something that we see a project maybe go on a compliance plan for on occasion is targeting. Maybe they did the math wrong on calculating income when a tenant moved in. We happen to notice that it was calculated incorrectly. And so we'll just work with that sponsor organization to make sure that the next tenant moves in is income qualified and they are within the targeting commitments that you applied for. examples of it's rare that a project have to repay an AHP subsidy. That is, we award the money not to get it back. So we will work with you to try and get whatever compliance issues the project is having back in compliance.
Johnny, real quick, if I could add on to that from a home ownership perspective, that's like the rental side of it. Rental projects will fund prior to the project being complete. Home ownership projects fund as a unit is completed, so whether it's sold or rehabilitation. The only time there would be money paid back from a home ownership standpoint if there was a purchase involved, right? So a new construction purchase, we would fund that, and then that money would come from the homeowner, not the sponsor, and that's if they did not stay in the home for that 5 years and it's prorated out over that.
Our next question is from Nancy. If you wanted us to unmute you, let us know, Nancy. She asks about tribal reservation lands for points.
Tribal reservation lands for points. We're going to get the 13 points as long as it's the sponsor entity is tribal.
Came Renee when it was talking about at arm's length. So I work a lot with the housing authorities, and they either get the land leased over on a master lease from the tribe or whatever, and it seems like they might lose those points and automatically be at a, you know, detrimentally. So I was wondering if there was a difference, since it's almost more like federal government or state government.
There, you know, unfortunately, if it's a tribal land being like a long-term lease to like a housing authority, et cetera, that does not qualify for points in priority or criteria 1. The usually making up those 13 points in criteria 7 doesn't usually have an impact as long as you're hitting some other things like that empowerment service, et cetera. The numbers that Ryan went over in terms of how successful projects are taking that into account, that those generally aren't getting points in criteria 1.
Okay. And then this is a different question that came up just on a comment you just made. And I think Ryan said, did you say that the monies go in on home ownership after the completion of the construction?
Correct.
Or, so we can't use it for the actual construction costs? It
Correct.
pays back?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And next we have a question from Tani Brunch, but I think there are 2 Tanis in the attendee list. So their question is regarding 5-year retention document, parentheses deed restriction for home rehab. Has that been changed recently?
So there is no, that changed 2 years ago off the top of my head for rehabilitation work. So that's really positive change. So that used to be in play. There is, you know, for new construction or act rehab sale. So yep. So that has changed about a couple years ago. And hello, Tawny.
The next
Hi.
question is from,
Wait, so this,
Tani, do you want to follow up with your question?
this is Tawny Brunch. I think that was the wrong Tawny.
Oh,
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it froze up there, but so that wasn't my question. It was a good question, but it wasn't my question. My question is more just about future webinars. I guess I appreciate OWISTA and Federal Home Loan Bank kind of getting these webinars together, and the fact that we can use OWISTA's outreach, you know, to make sure that the Native CDFIs are aware of the programs that Federal Home Loan Bank offers. But one thing that I don't know enough about, honestly, and I used to be on the advisory council still, is how do CDFIs, including native CDFIs, become members of Federal Home Loan Bank?
I would have to get you more information on that one. I'll be honest with you. I would have to dig into that one, Tony.
I believe they're
And
allowed
if we might devote a webinar.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just cut off again, but I just said not only membership, but also then if we could learn more about the community investment advances that you have available for mortgage and commercial lending.
Yeah, these are great ideas. We're writing them down, Tani. And we might hold you to, and you might be invited to some.
Great.
Great. And next we have a question from Anita. Anita, if you like, I can unmute you. But then also go ahead and read your question. Hello, would the preservation of a project-based voucher contract count towards the preservation of federally assisted housing category? In this instance, the project will be demolished and rebuilt with more units, and the PBV contract will be preserved / reassigned to the new project.
So yes, it should, and it could qualify if it's a project-based, and so we often see these with like Section 8 vouchers, that it's a project-based, and we have seen it before where they're going to demolish the existing building, and those vouchers are going to be transferred over to the new, as long as all the documentation's in alignment, etc. It could qualify for those 10 preservation points.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Emily has a question if she wanted to be unmuted. Otherwise, we could read that. She asks which % of applications are typically funded. I think that there was a slide that spoke to some of that further in the presentation.
And that spoke to specifically tribal applications, I believe, right?
It did. So when we think about it overall, and this is a directional, I think, we had about 67, 70-ish projects that we funded last year, right? Overall, all in that we funded, and I think there's probably about 180, 190 applications that came in. So, once again, when you think about that, the native side of it, and 3 out of 4 coming in, it's really a great opportunity to continue to grow in this area.
It does also depend upon how much funds we have to award on a particular year. And so as Ryan, the first slide was, who was the Federal Home Loan Bank? Oh, jumping jacks time. We award 10% of our earnings on an annual basis. And so how much we have to award is dependent upon how much the bank earns on an annual year. And so I think last year we awarded roughly 41 million in HP grants. And this year it is going to be less than 41 million. So we don't have that exact number right now, but it will be less than 41 million. So those are all contributing factors to what's the percentage that get awarded.
Our next question is from Johnny. If you'd like to be unmuted again, Johnny.
Okay. How involved do members need to be in the process? I know from some of my previous experience with before Federal Home Loan Bank Des Moines and Seattle merged, when it was Seattle, there was a piece where the member had to kind of underwrite that project as though we were the ones giving out the funds. How involved do members need to be with Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines with that process?
Sure. And that's a great question. We you know, for the Des Moines Bank at least, the member has to approve the submission of both the application and the disbursement request. We let the members decide and make that determination on how in-depth they want to do their underwrite. And just from my experience here at the bank, there are a wide variety of banks and how they do that. I mean, some I don't think they just do a cursory review, and some are more in-depth. And we don't dictate your comfort level. That's really up to you as an individual bank. You do submit it. And so you do have to, after the sponsor does all the application work, they essentially in the online application system, approve it. It comes to you if you were the member bank for you to review and approve. And then once that comes to us, then we can review and approve it. I will say that we do, like I said, months and months of due diligence and feasibility and scoring on these projects before we would feel comfortable awarding a project.
So in the event that, and the reason I ask is that bankers will be hesitant if there's any sort of risk that the bank would be on the hook then for, you know, recapturing those grant dollars or something like that. So as far as you know, as far as you're saying, we can be as involved as we want to be. We can make sure that we do our own due diligence on it. But you guys are going to really kind of make sure that these are projects that are worthy of being awarded. And,
Yes.
and so we just kind of are the pass through to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, certainly. We also, as we mentioned earlier, that retention document. So that's an important document that's actually signed, basically putting a lien on a property that discusses the Federal Home Loan Bank and the grant amount, et cetera. That lien is in the member bank's name and in the project's name. And so Federal Home Loan Bank isn't even a signer on that lien, although we're obviously referenced because it's our subsidy, but we don't sign it. I always tell member banks it's important to not release that lien prior to the end of the retention period unless you had approval from us to do so. That is in full transparency where a project or where a member bank could have opened themselves up to risk. Most banks and financial institutions have very in-depth policies and procedures that they're just not willy-nilly releasing liens without prior approval. Does that help?
It does. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Our next question is from Dawn.
Hi. Question is, I have a tribe who's working with wanting to possibly apply, but I'm trying to steer them away from tiny homes. That's what they've got. That's what they've been doing, and I'm trying to steer them away from those to smaller single family homes. I'm assuming the answer is yes. Tiny homes excluded?
For rental projects, no, they're not excluded. We have some caveats. You know, they have to have they have to have almost like a certificate of occupancy or equivalent, so to speak. So they have to have a bathroom, running water, heating and cooling, etc. If the footprint just happens to be smaller and considered a tiny home, it's still eligible. We've actually awarded a few tiny home projects in the past.
Oh, great. I was wrong. Thank you.
They need to have the amenities that a typical single family dwelling would have, if that helps.
Okay. And that's only for the rental, not for...
I'll let Ryan speak on home ownership.
We have not had a tiny home project come through. And honestly, what I'd want to do, Don, is sit down and talk with you a little bit more about it, just understand it a little bit more before I did say yes or no. So that would be the best thing to do, quite honestly, because it is unique. I know there's more and more of this coming up and things are changing, but just from a home ownership, we just haven't been poised. So just want to take a look at the project, to get a little bit more details.
Awesome. I will reach out. Thank you.
And Denise has added the contact information in the chat for both Renee and Ryan as well. Anita, you have the next question.
Sure, yeah, I was just asking about, I believe one of the threshold requirements is around, or one of the criteria is around construction cost per square foot. And I'm just hearing a lot about construction cost escalation being a big deal. And I know it sounds like that just providing the explanation, means that you're asking us to provide an explanation if we're over, and just wondering how you might approach that, what you recommend.
Sure. Yeah, you're right that there is a hard cost calculator, and that can be found on our website, and it's out there right now. We just updated that cost calculator last year, which did help quite a bit, as you had mentioned, the last several years, especially with the current market conditions, et cetera, and the pandemic. Costs have skyrocketed, and we're aware of that. If you upload or submit an application for a project that is outside of what we call an acceptable variance for your costs, yes, exactly. So submit an application or submit a justification as to why that is. And so, for tribal projects, for instance, sometimes we're seeing high costs because of the rural nature of the project location, which is going to drive up costs, et cetera. So I usually say, costs are the way they are for a reason. And we're not in your area. You just need to be able to tell us what those reasons are. And I realize right now, and especially right now as environment, it's not always going to be quantifiable. But do your best to try, and we'll work with you. So we've got analysts who, when they're doing your feasibility review, if we have more questions and we can't quite get there on why your costs are high, we will continue to ask questions in an attempt to get some resolution and some good justification identified. Does that help?
Yes, great, thank you.
Next question is from Emily. Would you like to be unmuted?
Hi, I was hoping for just a little bit more detail about the annual reporting requirements. Curious about what information you look for, and if you ever accept reports that are provided to other project funders.
I'll answer the last question first. Unfortunately, we don't accept reports that are provided to other funders. Sometimes those help fill out our reports for you, but we can't. We have to have our own spreadsheets completed. Did you want to answer the other question? The monitor, I guess I would question, is it rental or home ownership? Or are you asking just kind of openly for both?
Well, for our project, I'm curious specifically about rental.
Rental, okay. So the monitoring, you would do a semi-annual progress report, and this is during the development phase. So if you were awarded funds, twice a year, we ask you to log on, and we'll email you and let you know when the time is to do that. I'm going to ask a series of questions, just giving us essentially a progress update on how your construction or rehabilitation is going. Well, also, as Ryan had mentioned, we do 3 underwrites, and that's at application, disbursement, and after project completion. Those are pretty in-depth, I'll be honest with you. We ask for updated costs, updated pro formas, updated sources and uses if those have changed, et cetera. And then the project moves into what we call long-term monitoring. And that would be for rental projects, we do an annual certification. That's done on our the online platform. And so again, that's you're notified via email that it's time to go in and do your long-term certification. And we're going to ask questions like, is your project habitable? Are you still doing what you said you were going to do in the application? Is there anything that we should be aware of? Those sorts of questions. And then for most projects, we're going to do long-term monitoring. It's either 2, 4, or 6 years, depending upon your grant size. The higher your grant award, the more often we do it. So for instance, you had the maximum grant amount of $750,000. We would monitor your project every 2 years, and that entails us getting a current rent roll. And we'll email you and give you the form to fill it out on. And then it could entail us getting a sample income documents for a certain number or percentage of your tenants. And what we're looking for is if those documents match and then you've calculated your income essentially correctly, et cetera, then we both go on our merry way until the next monitoring cycle.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Quick follow-up. Is there ever any financial monitoring done? Do you ever need to see like operating statements or audits from the properties?
No,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
Our next question is from Marcia. Would you like to be unmuted, Marcia?
Hi, good afternoon. In the past, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, most of the down payment assistance went through member banks. And I'm curious if, one, it's eligible under this program, and two, if it is, how competitive it has been in the past.
Marcia, are you asking about the down payment assistance by chance?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it is a member bank driven program, so not a sponsor on that, and it is competitive. It's $7,500 for the down payment, but then for NAHI it is $15,000. So it is member driven still through members, but $15,000 for NAHI.
Sure, thank you. A follow-up to that, has there been any consideration given to have it competitive for nonprofits with a bank sponsor?
Yeah, we do have a down payment piece of this as the competitive, absolutely, as one of the programs. I'll be honest, most people, I haven't seen one come through in probably 4 or 5 years in that process, but there is a down payment piece to the competitive side of it, Marcia.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
There's a question in the chat from Iris that is also centered around down payment questions. Did you have other follow-up to the discussion just now, Iris?
Yeah, I was wondering if, if someone has an AHP homeownership project, can they then also leverage with the NAHI down payment assistance for that project?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. So you can use one or the other on that.
Okay, thanks.
There's also a question in the chat if Ryan could clarify AHP's eligible uses relating to new construction for homeownership projects.
Sure, naturally how it occurs, and we touched a little bit on it on the back end where we fund at the back end of the disbursement. So we look at the whole all in the closing and the construction of it, as well as developer fees, any fees like that. And let's say it's $40,000 per unit that we do. It normally goes in to get that person affordable to the affordability ratio that we need of that. So it goes into generally the cost of the project itself or the individual project itself.
Were there follow-up questions from anyone on that note regarding new construction projects? Next question is from Manuela. Would you like to be unmuted? Otherwise, I can read that. Does monitoring for rentals include annual or semi-annual on-site inspections of the units?
Not typically, no. We generally will do most of our monitoring just with documentation. We can, if we decide to do an on-site inspection, I will say it's pretty unusual.
Manuela, do you have any follow-up questions with that? And then I see Johnny's hand is still raised. I'm not sure if that was from previous questions, but we wanted to see if there were any other questions out there that anyone wanted to ask or be unmuted. And I'm not sure if the presenters, Renee or Ryan, had any other last communications to provide. We are going to be sending this out on email, a link to the presentation and the emails for our presenters, their contact information in there as well.
I would just encourage anybody that if they've got, it sounds like we've got a handful of projects here that might be really good applicants. And so if you've got more questions, certainly feel free to reach out directly, and either myself or Ryan can help you, or we can connect you with one of our team members to provide more assistance.
Wonderful. If there's no other questions, we'd like to, oh, I see something in the chat come through. Yes, thank you all for the wonderful information. And we're always happy to be able to connect our Native communities and partners like Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines and really just elevate Indian country. We wanted to thank you all for participating today. We'll give you back 13 minutes of your day that I'm sure everybody could appreciate. And thank you again, Renee and Ryan and Denise. Thank you for always rocking out tech support. Great to see
Thank
some
you.
friendly faces.
Thank you.
Have a great day.